administration, and the budget request is still late. I know that the fiscal year 2014 appropriations process didn't finish until January, but the Ryan Murray Agreement provided fiscal year 2015 top-line appropriations to use in December, and the request was still late. So I hope next year's budget is submitted on time. Regarding your appropriations, a little concerned that you still asking for an increase in your operating account. These are difficult fiscal times, and most Americans want to see their nation's leaders lead by example. And between 2010 and 2014, total discretionary spending has been reduced by 13%. During the same time period, the House members' office budgets have been reduced by 16%, but OMB's operating budget has only been reduced by a little over 3%. So I know that you have a lot to do and your staff have a lot to do, but again, I'd love to see more leadership, leadership by example. That's why we reduced the members' budgets by 16%. Our constituents don't ask us to do 16% less work. We just have to find a way to do all our work, and we do it with existing revenues. Regarding your request for a $12 million increase in the IT oversight and reform, I appreciate the fact that the administration has made efforts to improve the use of IT resources. You're doing cloud computing and data entry consolidation and other efforts. But I'd like to understand, if you're in charge of all the IT, it'd be interesting to know how the healthcare.gov failed to launch successfully, and maybe how we can make sure those don't happen in the future. Now, we may not always agree on budget policies, but I've raised some concerns with your budget request, but I do recognize the challenges that you face. And the committee appreciates your hard work and all the hard work that's done by the OMB. So we look forward to hearing your testimony. And now I'd like to turn to my ranking member, Mr. Serrano.
Thank you. And by the way, I know why it didn't launch the way we wanted. They should have gone to a college dorm and gotten a couple of kids. They would have done it right away, and no problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also like to welcome our director of OMB. OMB is the agency in charge of ensuring that our government operates in an efficient, fair, and responsive manner. Your role in developing the budget, managing agency performance, and coordinating regulatory action places you at the core of how our government operates. Because of this, your budget request, while somewhat small compared to other agencies under our jurisdiction, has a wide-ranging impact. Your request for this year includes a small increase to help ensure you have the personnel needed to meet these various responsibilities. It should be noted that the President's fiscal year 2015 budget, prepared with your counsel, stands in stark contrast to Representative Ryan's Republican budget. The Republican budget fails to create jobs while slashing critical parts of the nation's social safety net, such as Medicaid, which has cut $732 billion over 10 years, and SNAP, otherwise known as food stamps, which is cut by $125 billion. On the other hand, the administration's budget request creates a strategic plan that makes investments in the American people, their livelihoods, and their welfare. I commend OMB for your role in these efforts. OMB also plays a vital role in coordinating our government's policies with regard to federal employees, contracting, and procurement. Because of the sequester over the past few years, the size of the federal workforce has shrunk. We must make sure that even in tough budget times, we're working to protect those people who do such important work on behalf of the American people. And when we use contract workers, it is important that we hold those contractors to the highest standards of fairness and equality. That is why I was heartened by the President's recent executive order to raise the minimum wage for all new contracts signed by the federal government, and yesterday's executive orders to help eliminate gender-based pay disparities among government contractors. I'm also interested in your efforts to promote data-driven innovation, DDI, in fiscal year 2015. As the coordinator for DDI activities, OMB is partnering with leaders in states, localities, foundations, and research organizations to help ensure good policy making through data-driven analysis. This is important work And as with every federal agency, I want to encourage OMB to work with leaders, officials, and entities in the territories as part of these efforts, as well as in the states, of course. OMB's missions parallels the responsibilities of the Appropriations Committee, examining the effectiveness of federal programs and creating a budget that reflects our nation's priorities. I hope that we can have an honest conversation about OMB's challenges and what this subcommittee can do to partner with your agency to ensure the successful completion of both of our missions. Thank you for your service and for appearing in front of us of this subcommittee today, and I look forward to a productive discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Burwell. We'll turn it over to you. We'll make your written statement part of the record, and if you could limit your oral testimony to about 5 minutes, that would be helpful.
Will
The floor
do.
is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Serrano, and members of the subcommittee, want to thank you for the opportunity to present the President's FY15 budget for the Office of Management and Budget. I want to begin by thanking the subcommittee for all the work on the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2014, an important step to returning to the appropriations process and regular order. Today, I'll discuss the President's FY15 budget request for OMB and our work in the management, budget, and regulatory spheres, work that this subcommittee is deeply familiar with. First, through the budget development process, support of the appropriations process, and ongoing management and oversight of agency budgets, OMB drives high-quality execution of the nation's fiscal policy and management of critical government functions. Secondly, by working with more than 100 agencies throughout the federal government, OMB aims to improve overall management and deliver impact through improved efficiency, productivity, and quality of critical government services. For example, we're encouraging and expanding strategic sourcing, our effort for the federal government's buying power to save on essential purchases. These efforts have saved over $300 million since 2010. In the regulatory space, OMB's work protects the health, safety, and environment of the Americans while promoting economic growth, job creation, and innovation. The regulations that OMB has reviewed over the past 5 years are expected to have an overall value of $200 billion annually when implemented. And at the same time, the administration is also focused on streamlining, modernizing, or repealing regulations on the books that impose unnecessary burdens or costs. This regulatory retrospective review, or look back, has resulted in over 500 initiatives that the agencies are pursuing to reduce costs, simplify the system, and eliminate redundancy and inconsistency, with $10 billion in savings already in the near term and more to come in the future. OMB's budget request is designed to deliver against these core missions while supporting our expanded role in a number of key priority areas that the Congress has called on OMB to take on, including implementation of the Budget Control Act, supporting performance management through Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, ensuring improved financial management and transparency and accountability under the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, and supporting new contracting, spending, and security requirements under the National Defense Authorization Act. As this committee knows well, even while OMB has taken on a number of new functions and responsibilities in recent years, our funding and staffing levels have been significantly constrained. As a result of sequestration, OMB employees were required to take 8 furlough days last year. That's the most of any agency in federal government. The budget request would bring OMB back up to staffing levels comparable to 2009, though well below staffing levels of recent years. This is a critical investment with large returns in the form of improved program management, budgetary savings, smarter regulations, important outcomes that the administration, Congress, and the American people look to OMB to deliver. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to continuing to work closely with the subcommittee on our shared priorities for OMB and supporting the committee's efforts moving forward on the FY15 appropriations. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. And we'll have questions, and I think we'll try and observe the 5-minute rule so members can keep that in mind, that there's a little light and that will help the members remember the 5-minute rule. So let's start by, let me just make sure, one of the most important things you do is submit the budget for the federal government. And when you submit it late, it makes everything else get behind, and we're all trying to get back to regular order, and we're doing a pretty good job this year. I just want to be sure you understand that it's due the first Monday in February, right?
Absolutely, and I respect those deadlines. The mid-session review, since I became OMD director, we delivered a week early. We received in addition to needing the top line, in order to do the work that an appropriations committee, we actually needed the appropriation level. 7 weeks and 1 day from the date in which we got those numbers, because we received the numbers the same day they were posted for members to see in terms of the vote, we put out a budget. And so take that very seriously. Wanted to get these numbers up as quickly as possible. We took what is a 3.5-month process and did it in 7 weeks. I take deadlines extremely seriously and continue to work to meet them. I want to work as part of a team to return to regular order.
Great. And so next year we're going to work to have them right on time.
I am excited to see all appropriations bills delivered to us on October 1st, and we will be there.
Great. Let me just ask you about your request this year. I know that last year I think there was money to add 40 new staff members. I think this year they proposed another 25 in your budget. Maybe if that's not right, you can tell me. But it's about a little bit over, was it maybe 4.5% increase this year? And I know you've got lots of responsibilities, but other agencies that you oversee when you submit their budget, some of those programs are cut for different reasons. And so tell us how you go about, I know you have a lot to do. How do you decide what areas in the other parts of government aren't going to be funded as much as last year, and how do you decide that you need just a little bit more each year?
So I know this committee knows the constraints of the 15 levels, and you all understand that while we have some of the sequester buyback, it's still a very tight level. And as we went through the entire budget process, it was difficult to make the trade-offs and decisions that we made. And I take very seriously your point in your opening statement about leading by example, and want to do that. In the case of OMB and the decision that we made in terms of the dollars and the amounts, you are correct. We have a $4.2 million increase that is a 4.6% increase on our budget. From the period of 2010 to the present, OMB has had a 9% decrease in its budget. With regard to our FTEs, that translates to 11% because OMB is only people. We don't really have anything else to cut. There aren't grants, there aren't we don't do a lot of mailings, we don't do anything, we are people. And so that is a deeper cut. At the same time, during that same time period, CBO has increased by 9%. And while the functions are different in terms of, as you articulated, we do execution post-passage of legislation, our colleagues there have seen increases. When we think about, I listed some of the things that Congress has asked us to do in addition. Since I was here before, take for instance GIPRA modernization. In GIPRA, the first Government Performance Results Act, what we saw was 18 mentions of OMB. In the current one, there were 40 mentions of OMB. Right now, we have taken the over 2,000 pages that were on different websites and brought that together in one form. We have set cross-agency priorities. So across the board, the functions that OMB has been doing have been continuing to expand. In addition, as I look and make decisions, OMB went in some of the ratings of the Federal Employee Survey, which I take seriously as I try and manage an institution. We went from 3rd to 34th in a number of ratings. And I think that's a combined combination of things that have happened over a period of years. And what we want to do is make sure we are able to serve and deliver both for the administration and the Congress and the American people.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You've been here now almost a year, but you served as deputy director there during the Clinton administration. Can you give us an impression of the agency and its employees and what changes you've seen from the time you were there as deputy director and now in your new role?
A couple of changes that I've observed in the year, and probably one thing that I didn't completely recognize as I was coming back to take the job, and that is the strain that has been put on our career staff. And career staff, that as you reflect, is career staff for any administration, Democrat or Republican. And that strain in terms of what it's meant to have the hiring freezes, the pay freezes, the furloughs that occurred for the team. My first day at OMB last year was an alternative furlough day. And what all that means at the same time of the uncertainty. We like regular order. We like to do the budget on the timetable. But if we don't have the numbers, we're trying to guess, trying to scramble. The implementation of sequester last year, all of these things have contributed to what I think is an additional strain on the organization. The other thing that I have seen is, and I think this is a positive thing that we should do, and that's a greater expansion of the management responsibilities that have been given by the Congress to OMB. And that's in areas which I'm sure we're going to talk about today, from information technology to the performance management. And the idea that it is one of the first times in terms of implementing the GIPRA modernization that we have cross-agency priorities and agency priorities that are printed as part of the budget. So we get that alignment of goals and money, and we start bringing those things together.
Now, you practically answered my second question, which was the effect of sequestration and the shutdown and all that. And we've been asking all the agencies to tell us, and you told us, really. But in your case, or in the case of your agency, our understanding is that morale is very low at OMB, and that it has been for a while, and your agency has rated low in job satisfaction surveys. What do you think accounts for that, and what are you doing to fix it?
So a number of things I think account.
Because, you know, we have so many different agencies that face so many difficulties. Then you wonder why this one is the one that gets rated lowest. You know, I mean, what's
a couple
the issue?
of different things. And one, I think because we are all people, any of the cuts, as other agencies have attempted to manage during fiscal constraints, they've been able to change other things. Other departments actually have a larger ability, whether that's through their grant making, their conference spending has been cut, travel has been cut. OMB does a very limited amount of that, and so the only places we cut are people. At the same time, the dramatic uncertainty that occurs. When I first started, we thought we would have 10 furlough days. We were able to manage it down to 8. But that dramatic uncertainty and people not being paid for those days. The other thing is handling all of these things. Sequester is a very difficult thing to handle and manage department by department. It had never been done in this way. And I'm sure I'm going to get some questions and actually in conversations about why sequester was applied. Applying something like that, doing all the work to help the agencies do it, helping all the agencies during shutdown. While they're making the decisions, they consult with us in terms of, are they breaking the Anti-Deficiency Act? The other thing is we wiped away all training and development. And just like you all going back to your districts, that's how you learn what's going on. When we can't have an examiner go and visit at least some semblance of the work, the programmatic work they're doing, that inhibits their ability to do their job. And that is the type of thing that I think is affecting morale.
Right.
And that's why we have the money for training and development in the budget. That is one of the increases you see in our numbers.
So the answer to what are you doing to fix it is you're trying to get us not to do those things again.
And our budget.
That added to and having a budget on time. I have a little time. Let me just ask you something. You're requesting funding for a paid summer intern program. Could you explain why that is needed, and who would these interns be?
So the paid intern program is something that I think is actually very important to recruiting high-quality people. And in 1985, I was a Lyndon Baines Johnson intern here on the House side. Canon 252, Congressman Nick Joe Rahal. Wouldn't have been able to do the program had I not had some type of pay. I worked at the beginning of the summer at another job and at the end to make it all work in terms of what I needed to do. These paid internships, I think, are a very important part of making sure that the people that we get in the federal government are not just people who can afford to not work, be paid for a summer. And so in my own personal case, I think it's extremely important to build the institution and to recruit in a high-quality way that's actually cost-efficient. This is an important program.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, good to see you. I know you and I have had some conversations, and I think it would help the committee here, the panel, to learn a little bit about the process that you're working through, because I think many members in the House have struggled with some of the decisions that have come forward, and for the panel's sake, in this case, I'll be speaking about the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, where it was authorized in 1999, has had bipartisan support in the state for that entire period of time, and through the budget agreement of last year was provided for, and then even in the omnibus as well, and then OMB sort of made a decision to hold until what we understand WRDA passes, gets through its final stages here. And so, Director, could you just explain to us your thinking and why that I guess hold is in place at this point, why the Corps is not allowed to proceed until WRDA passes, and how that impacts other projects, because I know there's a tremendous backlog. There's a lot you're dealing with, and I want to commend you on what you're trying to do to bring fiscal responsibility to this place. And so, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate your explanation.
Be happy to. I first want to say that the Savannah project is a great one. It's an important one economically, from a macroeconomic perspective for the nation. It's important for the region itself. It is something that we support and are excited to see come to fruition. The issue in terms of where we are in the process for this project actually has to do with the basics of fiscal responsibility. And it has to do with the fact that when projects have been a certain period of time and have certain cost increases, and often that occurs because it's been a while since the original authorization, that you see cost increases occur in these projects. When that occurs, we believe that the Congress needs to speak again in terms of authorization. And that is why we believe this project needs to go to WRDA, go through and be passed as part of what you all choose. This is a place where we work with the Congress both in terms of the priorities and the fiscal responsibility, and so I'm clear about that. The backlog in Army Corps projects is $60 billion. That's how much we already have approved and starts and everything going. While this is a terrific project, if one makes the exception that this does not have to have the reauthorization, there are many other projects, and I think some of you may know them, that have very, very high percentage increases in costs. And without some mechanism of control, the issues of fiscal responsibility. So this is very tough, because this is, as I've said, a very worthy effort. But in trying to maintain some control, this is why we have made the judgments we've made. We're excited to see WRDA passed. We're working hard, as you and I have discussed, to try and figure out, are there ways to speed once that happens? But we do believe we need to work with the Congress on the question of starts and controlling Army Corps spending. And it is a very, very difficult thing, because these things are important in people's states and district, and we recognize that.
Thank you. And if you could maybe expand upon that too, just to help us understand how we as a Congress, as a House, need to be thinking and processing. Assuming there's a project that the expenses have gone up, no fault of their own, it's just been time. Maybe it's various reports or requirements that Congress has imposed on it as well. At what point should reauthorization be sought? And I'm speaking for any project out there, should members be mindful of? I think that would be helpful to know that, so that we're all looking ahead and preparing, because I imagine some of these that you mentioned in the backlog are probably quite old, probably date pre-1999, I would imagine.
So with regard, I think the Army Corps has a set formula, actually, that determines when a project meets that standard and needs reauthorization. I think one of the things that is also helpful is, because the authorization process and the appropriations process of things are not always completely aligned, the question of the information that I just shared in terms of the backlog isn't always presented as you're doing authorizations. And I think it is important to connect the two, as it will be very important, and many great things are going to be done, hopefully, in WRDA, but making sure that everyone is actually clear that what you actually are voting on, is a certain amount of spending, is the other thing that I think is a helpful part of the process, because otherwise it doesn't happen until the back end that it all gets added up. And so I think that's important, and the Army Corps has a set number that when these projects need to be reauthorized.
Well, and thank you for your support of the project. I mean, you've been very supportive. I know the President has been, the Vice President as well, and our Georgia delegation entirely. And you're right, it's regional. It's not about Georgia, quite frankly. It's regional. Assuming WRDA does pass, as it's written currently and from the House and the Senate perspective, what should the Corps expect next from OMB?
Well,
A
the course
direction
process.
to move forward?
The course processes are what happens is also related to the guidance we receive from the Congress with regard to new starts in FY14. And so at the next stage, what we'll have to do is review how the new start language that we were given as part of the FY14 appropriation process interacts with the approval and authorization in WRDA. And we will look to find ways to work with the Congress on that issue, but that will be a constraint that we may face.
Thank you. Thank you, Director.
Thank you. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for your service. I know OMB works very hard on transparency issues, but I want to talk about an aspect that perhaps we can all improve, that we can do better on, the lobbyist reporting with OIRA. GAO's recent testimony and some reports talked about how some of the lobbyist disclosure issues could be improved upon by OIRA. Have you contemplated this, or is there action taking place right now within OIRA to your knowledge?
With regard to the transparency issue, we always do believe we can do better. Right now, in terms of what currently occurs, is any time a rule is within OIRA and there is any meeting or contact, that meeting is publicly recorded. The attendees of that meeting are publicly recorded. And if there is any paper delivered as part of that process in terms of stating a position, that becomes a part of the public record. And so in an effort to try and make those things public, that is our effort today.
But are you aware of the GAO testimony recently and some of their reports analyzing perhaps some shortcomings, as they describe them, of OIRA's reporting along the lobbyist reporting lines?
Have not seen the specifics of shortcomings with regard to lobbyist reporting, so not familiar with the specific issue that GAO has raised.
We will pass that on, and if you could take a look at it and get back to the committee, we'd certainly appreciate it.
Be happy to.
The other aspects of transparency, you have a lot of data on the central website now, and you've made extraordinary efforts making this all accessible. But some of the budget summaries and numbers, why we need this part of budgets, is still scattered across a number of government websites. These justifications are not always available in, as a term of art, searchable, sortable formats. Many are in formats such as PDF that are hard for third parties to easily pull the data information out of that. So are you aware of this issue, and what's OMB doing to try to make one location, one place, a usable format for all of this information?
So I think the question of CJs, or Congressional Justification to Appropriations Committees, has been an evolutionary process, and some of that transparency has increased in terms of even getting things up on the agency websites in terms of how they do it. One of the things is that each subcommittee actually, each department works with their own appropriations committee, and part of the standardization has to do with different committees have different demands in terms of what they believe will help them do the job. And so as we think through this process, I think what we need to do is understand what are the needs of the committees and how can we meet those, and are the committees in a place where they are willing to agree on a standardized process or approach, and how we can think about doing some of that standardization to get to what you're suggesting in terms of something that could be overall. And so an issue that I think we need to work closely with the Congress, because in its initial form, the congressional justifications are about serving the Appropriations Committee. I think that should be something that is, it is publicly posted on many of the agencies' websites, but we need to think through if there can be further standardization.
So how much of the issue is the disparate type of information you're getting, or the fact that you're working with different subcommittees?
It would be both, because we do not tell the agencies, here is how you do your, we work with the agencies on their congressional justification, but at the programmatic level, they're much closer to it, and they do it. I think they tend to want to work very closely with their committees so that they're providing the accurate information. So it is a combination of both things, the need to, that different departments are producing information, but it's also that they're working with different committees.
Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with the committee on this and the full committee as a whole with the administrator on this. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much. First, again, thank you again for being here, and I must say on a personal level, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Chairman, I keep promoting you, which is a good thing. Right. Exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. Let me start this all over again, Mr. Speaker, President, and Chairman. No, again, on a personal note, it's in an administration that, even the press has dubbed as one of the most closed. I will tell you that you've been very accessible, and I think that's important. It's helpful, and so I just want to first thank you for that. I think that leads to good working environments, and so again, so I just want to bring that out here publicly. Thank you for that. I don't want to. The chairman has already talked about some specific issues. Let me talk a little bit about more of the budget recommendation. And at a time when, according to the CBO, revenue collection will exceed its 40-year average level, which is a good thing, obviously. That's a good sign. But yet the administration is still proposing some revenue increases, i.e., revenue, tax, whatever you want to call it, but revenue increases. And the question is, and in the conversation you and I had, we talked a little bit about, I think, one of the disappointments, and I think we had a very positive conversation, is the fact that we don't see the administration really leading on tackling really the driver of our debt, which is the mandatory portion of the budget. So even though the revenue is going to be at a record level, and even though you have revenue increases the president has revenue increases, my understanding is that it doesn't balance for at least a long, long time, and I don't know if it ever balances. So the question is this: is after 10 years, if we were to embark on that budget, what would be the actual debt held by the public, and also how about the unfunded liabilities? When you look at mandatory extras, do you have those numbers? And if you don't have them now, somehow I would suspect that you have those on the top of your head.
Some of those. Let's start. The debt to GDP ratio. Currently, the number is about 74%. And in our budget, by the end of the cycle, you get a stabilizing and declining debt to GDP ratio, and our numbers show it to be 69. So you do see what is a declining debt to GDP ratio, and I think that's actually a very important point, because I am fortunate to have had the opportunity to actually work on balanced budgets. When I was at OMB before, I've worked on 3 of the 4 balanced budgets that we as a country have had in decades. And so it's something obviously I think can be important, but I think the broader fiscal picture, a balanced budget is one piece of the picture and can be a measure and a tool, but I think what I focus on more is the debt to GDP, but what's most important is economic growth and jobs and opportunity. And I think what we hope is that the budget that we've created is a budget that puts us on the right trajectory for now. So right now, and I think even in the chairman's remarks, the idea of further discretionary change right now is contractionary and can harm our growth both in the short and long term with things like investments in infrastructure. And then the question is how one goes about handling those long-term entitlement issues that you just raised. And when you look at the drivers of those long-term entitlement issues, they're basically twofold. The first one is the issue of healthcare costs, and the second one is our demographics as a nation. And then you come to how you address. And in our budget, what we try to do is build on what is already built in, which is the Congressional Budget Office, since the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, its 2014 through 2020 numbers, which was the window they had at that time, has a $900 billion decrease in health care costs. And while all that is not attributable to the Affordable Care Act, there are other structural changes that cause that. We start to see that declining. We see controlling healthcare cost numbers, and then we have an additional $400 billion in healthcare savings that is in our budget. In addition, we believe that the issue, when you start thinking about those demographic issues, That's part of why immigration is so important. Because when the Congressional Budget Office went to look at that, the questions of increasing the labor force was a very important part of what contributed to the economic health. So that's how we put together the pieces. The issue of revenue, we believe that even with the cuts, and it's $5.3 trillion over the period. That's how much there is in cuts and spending and deficit reduction if you look at our budget from the 2011 period. But 2-to-1 is the ratio of cuts to revenue in that. And we just believe you can't get the numbers to work without some of these revenue changes.
Out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Burwell, it's great to see you again. I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague, Mr. Diaz-Balart, who talked about your openness and your willingness to be a dance partner with us. We've been going stag to this dance for quite some time now, and it is really, really good to have the relationship that we have with you. But as a matter of disclosure, it should be noted that she was once a constituent of mine, so I would expect that out of her. There is one, I've said this in a number of hearings, that when you look at the federal government, in the totality of the federal government, there are a lot of inefficiencies. I mean, we just see them all the time. This government just is terribly inefficient in a lot of ways, and has been for under lots of different presidents, in my strong opinion. Before you came to OMB, you were the president of the Walmart Foundation. Now, there's a difference between the foundation and the company itself, but the cultures are very similar. And you know what the culture is there. It is very efficient, among the most efficient, which would explain why it's the biggest company in revenues in the world, between, well, one day to the next with another big company. Is there not a way that this federal government can do a better job of asking the private sector, the Walmarts of the world, who are experts at creating efficiency? How could we do a better job of asking our private sector companies to help us through these processes?
So I think in the management efforts and the management agenda that I mentioned in my written testimony, turning to some of these private sector practices is exactly what we should and need to do. For instance, in the area of shared services, and the idea that what we should do is you find the place that does it best in the government and most efficiently, and then you have them do it. And so certain financial functions, HUD is actually going to turn to Treasury because they're more efficient and more effective. And so that's one of the things that the private sector does, and that I had the opportunity to see when I worked at a place that believed in EDLP and EDLC, everyday low cost and everyday low price. And those two things come together as you think about it. Another specific example that I believe we can do more and more of is strategic sourcing. And so the question of making sure that the pencil that is bought or the pen that's bought at the Department of Agriculture is, if that's the lowest cost value, then at the Department of Veterans Affairs, they should be getting that deal too. And so strategic sourcing, where you look across the federal government, and we've already started saving money by doing that. But those are two very specific examples, and I think there are any number of others. And what we need to do is take those practices and move them as much as we can into the federal government.
You've already mentioned in your testimony that you were a deputy director of OMB when there were balanced budgets under the Clinton administration, and I give you credit for that. I'm sure there were times that you thought, you know what, I'm just the deputy director. If I was director, by golly, this is what I would do. So here's your softball question. You know, now that you are the director, having experience in balancing the budget, how can you take that experience now as director and help this administration get to balance again?
So I think a couple of things, and they've been touched on in a number of different places. I think one point actually is relationship, and that's getting us to the point where we all have enough relationships, and I think that's what got us to the place where we had deals and pieces of things. We're not all going to get everything we want, but if we can build that, and so that's one of the reasons in the roles and why the outreach that I do is because I think that's an important part. The other thing that I think is an important thing now that I am director and want to do and think is important is focusing on the management. And while as the director of OMB, I think, I love the budget side. I love the appropriations process. I think it's extremely important. I also think that it has to be integrated with the management. As you can hear through these specific examples, I spend a lot of time on the M because I think that's a place where we make government more efficient and effective in terms of what we deliver for the American people. The last thing that, in terms of what I believe is building a strong institution, because as you can hear in the question we just discussed, it is a very tough policy issue on a thing like Savannah, which I think is terrific, but trying to keep, some semblance of fiscal responsibility. So building strong teams that are great analytically and that can support you in that kind of showing you the issues to help you make decisions that are tough.
I want to thank you again for the openness that you bring to the table, the fact that you are willing to have a dialogue with us. I congratulate you for that and look forward to our future dialogues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Herrera-Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Burwell, for reaching out. I know we weren't able to connect, but I really appreciate your efforts. I wanted to bring up Army Corps in a little different angle than was previously brought up. The administration did voice their support for infrastructure and boosting U.S. exports, Washington State being a very trade-dependent state. And we have a lot of port and aging infrastructure in our region. But the President's FY15 request it actually reduced funding for the Corps by about $1 billion under the 14 enacted levels. And, when I think about our jetties and other things, it's the equivalent of 7 Katrinas a year hit the jetties to the mouth of the Columbia River. That's what a beating they take. And as you can imagine, they are crumbling. And it's incredibly important to the fourth largest inland waterway system that transports $1 billion worth of agricultural products down and out. One way we can address this is Congress needs to step up and put money here. I believe in that. Another way we can address this is we can fully spend the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. And that is something that you all have more input into. And I wanted to see if you could explain why the administration hasn't necessarily addressed some of these local and critical infrastructure needs for our ports and our waterways. I'm mostly interested in small ports and maintenance. We've spent a lot of money in deepening the Columbia River Channel. Now the silt is pouring into all the ports along the way. And so we don't want those last 20 years of work to be for naught. And I was hoping you could speak to that.
So a couple of things. One is in the infrastructure space, and I think infrastructure is broadly defined, and that is from ports to our roads to our critical infrastructure with regard to airports, next generation airports, to making sure that there is funding for actually veterans hospitals in terms of that core infrastructure. Across the board in the budget, we have put funding in for those things. In addition, with regard to the roads and that part of infrastructure that is more Department of Transportation related, we have said we would use the one-time revenues from changes in corporate taxation to do that, to see if we can find a place where we can come together.
I apologize. I'm specifically speaking to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund.
So
fully utilizing the trust fund.
With regard to the question of how exactly the ports and those decisions on a port-by-port basis are made, those are made by the Army Corps, generally speaking, and they use a set of criteria. And so the Army Corps generally makes the decisions with regard to which ports are funded, and they do that on a basis that has to do with tonnage coming through and a number of other criteria.
Absolutely. I guess from your perspective, maybe speak to the difference between the $1 billion cut in the President's budget for the Corps.
With regard to that, there were difficult choices, as was reflected in the opening statement of the chairman, and we did have to make difficult choices. And in making those choices, that was a place where we had to make the choices that we made. What we have done, though, is emphasize the importance of ports within that context, though. So there's the question of the overall Army Corps funding.
And
it
you're
was a
familiar
place-
with the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and how it's not getting fully spent?
The question of it not getting fully spent is the part that I'm happy to get back to you on. In terms of the question of it not getting fully spent is something that
Perhaps
would
this
be
is
a
an
new
area
issue.
where we can look at, and I
Sure.
urge you
Be
to
happy to
see if there are
follow up.
ways to more fully spend the money. It's taxed basically for people who use the ports, and they're begging us to use that money then for the maintenance, recognizing the backlog we have everywhere else. And that's something that perhaps you can be helpful with.
Be happy to. I think probably because of the inflow, it doesn't occur through the appropriate, through
Yeah.
the process that I, so I will
Absolutely.
follow up.
Can I bring up another? So flooding and flood risk management, specifically in Lewis County in my district, they've had an authorization and years of Army Corps look and study and so on and so forth. It's I-5. It's this area around I-5. In Lewis, so it's in between Vancouver and Seattle.
Yeah.
Did you live on the west side of the state? You probably did.
Yeah, I lived in Seattle,
So
so
some
yes. but
serious
have
flooding.
driven down to go to Portland. So I think I'm on the road right now that you're talking about. in my mind.
Exactly.
Okay.
We are hoping moving forward, and we'll provide you with more information. We're working with the Corps, that OMB and the President will provide a nod to this in his budget next go around. It's an issue that the Corps has committed to helping with. But we've had a lot of bumps along the road. The governor has convened a group in that area to put together the proposal that they want and need that will both protect I-5 and protect the region from flooding risk. And it's something that we're going to need help from your office in promoting in the FY16 budget. So I guess I'll just leave you.
Thank you, and look forward to getting some more information about that
Absolutely.
specific. That would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Capter.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I had conflicts and couldn't be here for the formal testimony, but I welcome Director Burwell here today. Thank you for your service to our country now and in former years as well. In that regard, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your budget request this year, if you were to compare the size of the federal budget today and our population as a country to the earlier period in which you served, and you look at the staffing levels of OMB today, what observation did you make when you arrived back?
So we talked a little bit about it, but in specific terms, when I was at OMB before, we had 516 people. And that was with the fewer responsibilities, and we've discussed some of those that the Congress has asked that, I think are important because many of them are about management, program management, actually direct management of the government and that sort of thing. I think they are important responsibilities, but the number has gone from 516 down to, we've been in the 450, 460 range. And both in 14 and why we're asking for the request in 15 is to try and bring us back part of the way, certainly not to the numbers that we saw in that time, but that is. In terms of this question of the size of the government and the size of different things, as one thinks about the percentage of GDP that our discretionary spending represents, if we are at the 16 sequester levels, it will be the lowest that we've seen since basically we recorded, which is the end of the Eisenhower administration, in terms of that spending as a percentage of GDP, to give you some levels of comparison.
Thank you. Thank you for placing that on the record. Let me ask you, one of the biggest issues that we've been facing with the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs is the electronic records sharing issue. Whatever you can do to dislodge the stalemate will be most appreciated. OMB seems to have a way of an ability, an uncanny ability to make things happen. And this has been everyone on the DOD committees, everybody on the VA committees up here is completely frustrated, especially with the Department of Defense. I said, why don't we just hire the Department of Veterans Affairs? Let them take care of it. And but somehow we've got to get these records seamless. And we are having real difficulty doing that. So for the electronic medical records and their symmetry, we would hope that OMB might be able to help us out.
It is a space, and information technology is a space that I think you see in our budget that we are asking for additional funds. To give you a sense of the numbers, the federal government spends $78 billion on IT on an annual basis, and we're asking it would be $20 million for us to do that oversight and management. I hear the frustration with this issue. It is something that we will engage with and are engaged with.
Thank you. We noticed that the agencies seem to be spending less on IT now than at the beginning of the administration. Can you tell us more about how OMB is working to improve government programs and operations to maximize the government's return on its technology investments?
Yes, thanks to this committee and the Congress, there were funds that were put in to do IT oversight. As part of that effort, in terms of that IT work, much of that work at this point has saved $2.1 billion. And it comes in a number of different forms. It comes in data consolidations, consolidation of data centers, so we have fewer of those. It comes in the form of reviewing projects that go and have problems and that we get in and try and create further savings. And so that's a report we do on a regular basis to the Congress, and we have seen that savings and we're appreciative, and that's part of why we're asking for funding, because while we've been able to do very well on efficiency, better cost, clearly, but October shows us we weren't very good on effectiveness. And that's the next frontier that we think we want to work on as OMB.
Thank you. And finally, I just wanted to make the observation and recommendation that some of your budget examiners take a look at, especially the policy examiners, take a look at the different federal departments and ways in which revenue that they recover, whether it's asset recovery on the drug side, whether it's IRS agents working very hard to collect taxes, whether it's the FBI or an inspector general doing something that brings revenue back. Right now what happens is they don't get any reward. It all goes back to the general fund. The agency, department doesn't get rewarded, and the individual doesn't get rewarded. I'm saying, what's the incentive? So if there's any way through the channels that you operate in, you can offer performance credit to those who are actually doing an exceptional job of recovery. I think that would be a very constructive way in which to move. You probably have your own organizations you have to work with that are out there on the executive side, but it just seems to me that we are missing the boat here and not rewarding outstanding performance. If a team does something really extraordinary, it seems to me we can't knock at Wall Street's door hard enough. And if there's a team over at the FBI that does a really good job, by golly, we ought to incentivize them to do more. And thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Burwell, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate your dialogue and openness, as others have remarked. I want to discuss some of the comments that my colleague Mr. Diaz-Balart brought up regarding the deficit and the national debt. And at $17 trillion, it's gotten to a point where many Americans, it's hard to even understand what that means to our future, what compounding debt and interest means going forward as we continue to pay off the excess of previous Congresses, and then we continue to overspend every Congress following. When budgets are submitted from the administration, they don't really have an endpoint where the budget would balance, much less ever pay off the debt. And so I think a lot of Americans just ask us, if we're going to borrow money, that we have to have a plan on how we're going to pay it back. Seems pretty simple. We have to do that in our personal lives. Government should have to do that. And it seems to set a really bad precedent for our country that this town and this culture has sort of become indifferent to this. Since it's always been here, it's sort of part of the culture. And I know you have experience working when we had some balanced budgets. I think in the last 50 years, the budget's been balanced maybe 6 times. So both parties got us in this mess. And so rather than maybe point the finger at one party, just say that, this town, both parties have been irresponsible with tax dollars and at least balancing our budgets. But there is precedent for the two parties working together to solve these problems, and you were part of several years in a row where you had a Republican House and Senate and a Democratic administration, and they found a way to put together balanced budgets. And we had some good revenue coming in. There were some unique circumstances, but at least it's a shining light in the darkness, maybe, of how we can get to some solutions in this town. And so I'm eager to work with you on how we get there. Mr. Diaz-Balart just sort of questioned what our debt looks like going forward. I've seen estimates by the CBO that we may borrow another $8 trillion over the next decade. I can't find a constituent that wants to see us do that. So when we have an entire set of constituents in every one of our districts that says that is an unacceptable outcome, Yet that is the path we're headed down. We've got $3 trillion in new tax revenue coming into this Congress, to this town over the next 10 years from a variety of tax increases that have occurred. Yet we always get back to more revenue, more tax increases, and Mr. Diaz-Balart was heading down this path. You talked about growth as being a key part of this solution, and I think we'd all agree that a rising tide that lifts all boats it helps this country, it brings in revenue, but we can't increase spending with that. And so we need lids on spending so that when revenue comes in, we know that we can reduce the debt as part of that. But I guess I'm more interested in your long-term solutions. I think we can debate about what to do this year, but as we ignore the long-term problems, they get worse and worse. And I noted that the Social Security trustees, the Treasury Secretary Kathleen Sylvia and others who are on this say lawmakers should address the financial challenges facing Social Security and Medicare as soon as possible. Taking action sooner than later will leave more options and more time available to phase in changes so the public has adequate time to prepare. I note that in 1962 we spent 14% of our budget on entitlements. Today we spend 47% of our budget on entitlements. In 2030 we're expected to spend 61% of our budget on entitlements. And so not only is an unsustainable amount of revenue, we couldn't bring in enough tax dollars to sustain that, it also crowds out education spending, research spending, cancer research, transportation spending, things that are important to both sides of the aisle. I note the President has a responsibility, and I think the statute says if there's a Medicare funding warning made in a year, the President shall submit to Congress within the 15-day period beginning on the date of the budget submission to Congress under subsection A for the preceding year proposed legislation to respond to such warning. Has there been a warning? Has the President responded to that? And if you agree that if there's a sort of understanding that short-term reductions is one topic, what are our long-term solutions? How do we fix this problem, particularly when it comes to entitlements?
So the entitlement issue, I think, is the one that we need to focus on, and we've discussed a bit. And I think the real question, though, is how one goes about addressing that entitlement problem. It is a problem. We want the deficits to come down, but what are the alternative choices, and what path do you put things on? You're absolutely right. I have, had the opportunity to actually work, and we created a Social Security lockbox so that those monies would not be spent. That was, in the last form when we got to balance, so that money actually went to deficit reduction, but it extended the life of the trusts. To your point about those things. And so I think the real question is what path we agree on that downward trajectory of spending in the entitlement space. And I know there have been many criticisms of the administration, with regard to our Medicare Advantage changes, in terms of Medicare changes. When we look at what we see in the proposal of the Ryan budget, it is about the specifics in the space. And what we believe is we've put forward specifics that take us on that right trajectory. We need to also continue to do the steps that promote overall cost containment. We have seen healthcare costs slow. That's important for the federal government and the deficit, but it's also important for the private sector. So I think the question is, what do you want as the slope of that line of decline on entitlements? And what are you willing to do it? And I think we were hopeful last year. The administration put forward in its budget actually a deal, which was a very unusual budget construct. It embedded what was, people refer to as the Boehner deal. That isn't what got us there. Clearly we weren't able to do that in terms of all of us coming together in a bipartisan fashion. What we're hopeful this year is if our expression of the vision of what we think is the right way, that we can end up, this is how we believe we should do it, and here are the specifics about how we do it. If there are conversations that others want to have, we welcome them about better ways than we have and what we've proposed. But we believe we have the right slope, and the right slope for economic growth, because while I think that many Americans are definitely interested in these issues of can you balance, how do you spend, I've had to tighten my belt over the last years in terms of the difficult economic situation. I think they're also interested in jobs and growth. And figuring out what tools we use to make sure that we're continuing on that trajectory is an important part of fitting all the pieces together.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions. I'd like to start that by asking two questions. One is about, we talked about IT, information technology. And as you know, in 2012, this subcommittee started appropriating money to OMB to oversee and reform some of the information technology. And I think most people would say there have been a lot of good things that have happened. And when you mentioned $78 billion, spent on IT. I think one time it might have been
85.
80 billion
85.
down. So there's been some savings, you know, and that's all well and good. I guess the question becomes, when you look at the rollout of the healthcare.gov that you hopefully were overseeing, and you'd have to say it didn't work out all that well. I mean, was that something that you were kind of trying to oversee, because it was trying to coordinate a lot of different agencies, I guess, together? Do you know what happened? Learn any lessons about as you look ahead to see how you can coordinate all the IT? Were there some lessons learned there?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think did work is the portfolio stat process is a process that came of this funding, and it was part of the IT process, which is a process of when you see a problem, how you put in a SWAT team to solve. And that part, in terms of the problem occurred, the team goes in, a team of highly specialized individuals, to work in a focused and concentrated way to get the site to the place where it is functioning. In terms of some of the things that we've learned and that we are going to act
Did
upon.
the SWAT team step in on this one, or step in too late? Or?
At the point at which we knew something was wrong. And that obviously is after October 1st, when we all knew something was wrong. With regard to some of the lessons learned as you review this, and these are things that we are focused on, and that is what the money in the budget is about. One of the things that wasn't working well is the business owner and the IT owner. And this happens in the private sector as well. People go, IT people fix it, and the business owner doesn't engage. The two have to engage together, so that it's not just usually an IT problem, it's also about how is it going to work, how should it work for the customer, and that the business owner understands better. So getting a closer connection between the IT people and the business ownership, issue one. Issue two.
But that's not a money issue, is it?
No, these are some of these are management issues, but the way in which you get it to happen, and that's what this money is for, is to create a SWAT, a team of best practices. We don't want to create this all over the government. We believe there should be a centralized place with the skills and best practices that then apply to different places and departments, so you don't create it all over the government. But these people are the people that help you do three things. The other thing is, historically, and this has to do with procurement in the federal government, we've kind of done a waterfall approach instead of a more iterative approach, which is important to IT, because in IT you need to take shorter bites. Things change. You need to test and try and redo. We weren't doing enough of that. The last thing is end-to-end accountability from point A to point B. And those are three things that we want to work on, and the ways we want to do it are, we want to focus on best people working on IT, best partners, because sometimes it is about the partner, and that's often, not always, but sometimes private sector. And then the third element is best procedures. There are complexities in the system that sometimes make it hard to get number two and number one, because some people don't want to come and work because they're like, you don't do this in an iterative fashion, you do it in a waterfall, and I, as an IT person, am not used to doing that. Or trying to get the best companies, it's too hard. And so just a week ago, GSA started something called FBO Open, and what it is a process where we can better source and people can gain information. They can't open the PDFs, to Mr. Quigley's conversation about search. You can open the PDFs, and so people who are high-tech firms who want to see if there are contracts they might want to do, they're able to search that better, so we may be able to track better players. And so there are a number of things that we need to do across the board to do that in terms of the problems identified and the key goals we're going to work against.
Sounds like a lot of those are management-oriented, and I know you've asked for an extra $12 million will be
Yes.
added to the $8 million. That's $20 million. That's a pretty big increase. But
It's people.
you know, a lot of times when you talk about IT, when you say 85 billion or 78 billion, people go crazy because every agency says, if you just give me some more money for IT, then everything will be working right, and it doesn't always seem to do that. So we'll look at that funding request, but I appreciate the fact that you're looking at the way people operate and their efficiencies and the way they manage their time and energy and things like that, because I think that's part of the problem
Right,
as well.
and part of that is, I think, having the people to go in and do the examinations at the front end. What has happened with the IT money we've gotten, it's, you know, about consolidations, data center consolidations, a number of things that are important, or coming in at the problem like we did in October. And in portfolios, we tended to do that. You can save a lot of money that way, and we do that. But I think we can do a much better job both with efficiency, better spending of the taxpayer dollars, but also effectiveness. One of the things we need to do is make sure that these technologies deliver for the customer. That customer-facing element, whether it's a private sector business or an individual who wants to get their veterans benefits, we need to work to make that work better.
Exactly. Thank you, Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, just a little while ago, I said to myself, in the final round, I will speak about IT. And it seems that everybody had the same thing in mind because that's where we went. And then it dawned on me something, and I say this with all due respect to the majority party. There are members of the majority party who are in a cost-cutting mood for the last couple of years, and all you hear from them is cut the budget. But IT presents a unique challenge. We could give you a bundle of money now, and in a year and a half from now, half of that equipment you bought is obsolete, or the programs are obsolete. And so we talk about entitlements, for instance, and how they keep growing or how they're going to be around for a while no matter how much you cut them. I don't think we factor in yet in our mentality in the House yet, or in the Senate for that matter, the fact that IT is here to stay. When I first came to Congress, it was all about paper records somewhere in Tennessee or in Iowa or somewhere. That's not true any longer. Everything now is somewhere on a computer, whether that's good or bad. Then after 9/11, you got into the issue of the cyber attacks and the fear of people doing a number on you and getting information that they shouldn't have. And then your personal privacy came into, although that's another issue, not necessarily tied to you. So my question to you is, can we ever reach, again, to satisfy folks who want to cut the budget, a neutral point in the IT area when it seems that anything we do for you changes in a couple of years? I mean, you even see it in what we take, what we have at home. With all the respect to Apple, which is great, you notice every time they turn out a new gadget, the charger is different, and you have to go buy a new charger. So breaking that down, that's breaking it down to its lowest denominator. But at your level, there are chargers that are different. There are programs that are different. Will you be able to say, for instance, to Mr. Yoder and Mr. Graves, as the chairman, we're at a level field now, we're playing, we don't need any more money for IT for a while, we're all set? I don't think that'll happen.
So I think embedded is actually an important concept that, as being at OMB, as I think about what's fundamental that has changed that 5-10 years from now that we need to be thinking about, and it is in the space of information technology. Information technology is going to continue to be something that both provides opportunity for cost savings at times, but also provides exposure as well. And the cybersecurity, I think, is extremely important in the space. Whether or not we'll ever get to a level where we don't need more, I think IT spending into the federal government has gone down from, it was 85 down to 78, and that is through better management. There probably are diminishing returns and investments that we should be doing that we're not doing in terms of certain types of things we need to advance. But to your point about how we think about that, that concept of capturing flexibility was a little bit of the waterfall versus the iterative. And another example I would give is this year, one of the things that was done, cloud computing is something that's important to use, but I'm sure you can understand, to your point about cybersecurity, we have to be very careful. And for any department, they would go to a cloud computer and they would have to go through a bunch of different certifications because we need to make sure the federal government's safe. Having said that, what we did was we basically created a situation, if a company goes and meets certain standards, and you're the Department of Agriculture and they met the standards overall, then if the Department of Veteran Affairs wants to use it and they have been certified, we create that efficiency. Cloud computing is also a way that we don't take on a ton of that capital expenditure, in the case that you're saying, the charger,
Right.
And we try and create flexibility that we can use. I think this is going to be a place that, you're right, we're going to focus on for a long time. I'm hopeful we can continue to find cost savings, but we also have to increase effectiveness.
Yeah, I've been around here long enough to remember, for instance, Y2K and how we thought the world was going to come to an end at midnight, strictly at midnight. Of course, people forgot that midnight is not in the same place at the same time everywhere in the world. But that was the fear, and nobody will really know unless someone writes a book about it someday whether it was Congress's involvement. I mean, that's all we spoke about. I remember in those days we would have a hearing, Mr. Chairman, and the first person we would ask, what's
Are
going to
you ready?
happen
Are
with
you
Y2K?
Y2K
You know, I
compliant?
mean, you know, are you ready for it?
Are you
know, and
compliant?
everybody was terrified of it, and that was the question, right?
Okay.
That was the only question of a hearing to start off. And that we got through that. But this is not going away. This is the way of the present. It's not the way of the future. So I suspect that as we look towards expenditures, government expenditures, and our desire to bring about balanced budgets and so on, that this particular area will continue to cost us loads of money for a long, long time, especially as we get into the area of other countries that can never match up to us militarily or otherwise, but can with a computer and a cyber attack. And so I just put that out for a thought, because it's a whole new world, and maybe we can find a charger that fits all. Thank you so much, and thank you for your service.
Well, like every other aspect of government, I think it's not so much how much you spend, but how you spend the money you
Right.
spend. So we have to keep that in mind. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I always enjoy Mr. Serrano's comments, and I try to never take your questions. I didn't mention IT or cuts, for that matter. But we do have a role.
It was
I
on
think,
your
and-
mind.
It's on my mind, yeah. But I will say, for the director's credit, they have operated with a lot less personnel than previously. I mean, you mentioned, 2009 levels in essence, a lot of furloughs. And so, we have to somewhat commend agencies and departments when they embrace the cuts or reductions and operate as well as they can. And they've certainly done a good job here, and I want to thank you for that. It's not easy for anyone to have to go through what we've been through. And I think back on the state of Georgia, and, teachers have been, the education system's been through the same strains, and furloughs have been there, and everyone working together is always the best way forward. But in thinking in that vein just a little bit, you've referenced regular order and getting back to that, and that's something we all embrace here in this committee. Do you have any recommendations, just looking ahead from a budget process perspective? Because it seems like we're pushed as appropriators into a window that you can't quite accomplish what you're tasked to do because of where we might receive the budget request from the administration, or even, for that part, our own budget passing the House or the Senate. And the window seems to be narrowing over time. Do you have recommendations? You have an extensive resume of being a part of a lot of successful areas and such. I mean, what would you suggest from a process perspective that we can make it through?
So, thought a little bit about it, but it's interesting because at the core, it's about forcing the decision making. And so I think the most fundamental question is how we get to a place where the decision making and the choices and the trade-offs can be made. And the committee process is actually a very important part of that. And so the question is, would a process change or a structural change in the process change that empowerment of the committee process? Because to your point, to get the work done and to get the choices, your colleagues depend on you all to know more than anybody else about this topic. And what has been missing in the past years when you do continuing resolutions, and that you don't have a budget process actually where we have a hearing and we actually have a conversation, as we are today about, we can differ on different points, but we don't have the opportunity to talk about the issues or the importance of something big that's coming down like IT. And so on the process front, I don't know that a process change will fix that. And it is a little more, it's interesting because I've thought about it, and I actually think it's actually more a question that you all will be able to answer than I would be able to answer, because I think you have a better sense of what is preventing the process from getting to the point where the committee makes choices. Because these are trade-offs. We can all talk about our single issues, but when you, the committee, have to review and you have a number of different pieces in your bill that are complicated, and you have an allocation. That's when the choices get made, and that's how it happens. And that has not been working. So the question I have is, what would help and support that process? And that's on the non-defense discretionary and defense discretionary side. The mandatory is another issue.
Yeah, I think that's a question for all of us. And Mr. Yoder has been putting together some working groups to sort of think through this, because our goal is to work through each bill in a very deliberative manner, to debate what are our preferences and priorities as minority and majority parties, and try to avoid the continuing resolution scenario or the large bill all packed together. And we see what happened ultimately was, while it's good that we have a 2-year budget agreement and such, when it happened then in the omnibus, then your budget's a little bit later than normal, which shortens our window to accomplish before the fiscal year. And it's like, how can we get the gyration correct? Right now we just seem to be out of whack a little bit. But thank you for your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the management side of your operation. In trying to make the best use of the precious taxpayer dollars to pay the costs of war that we have borne now for over a decade, and the gigantic Wall Street-induced recession, which caused a level of employment not seen since the Great Recession. The costs of digging out of all of that and the total collapse of this economy have been extraordinary. And we have to pay those bills. Meanwhile, there are those who suggest, well, the way you cut it out of seniors, or you cut it out of hungry children, and some of us choose not to make those choices. So really my question goes to, on the management side, do you have a mechanism to look at certain cost drivers of programs and suggest alternatives to them? For example, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in the invasive species account, in the last 15 years, if you were to look at those carefully, you would be amazed at what has happened. The American people are paying for the unaccounted costs of free trade. Emerald ash borer has eaten through ash trees all across the Midwest, to name just one species and one tree. It is costing a boatload to try to replant, to get our Forest Service involved in some of that, to try to remediate all the problems associated with just that particular creature. Right here in Virginia, the stink bug. People are selling their homes. Came in on Chinese packing crate. The perpetrators of the came in on cardboard. Who's paying the cost for remediation? Local governments, state governments, and the federal government. Research projects, try to get rid of these things. That account has just ballooned, and from a few $1 million to in the billions. That is a cost driver. What are we going to do about it? The answer isn't to have uninspected material that comes over the border, or to place a fee on those places that have shipped in product that has truly caused great harm here. That's one account. One can look at areas of our country that have had repeated disasters, coastal areas, for example, areas that have been flooded. And, we pass flood insurance, or we do this and that, and then the communities go back and rebuild in a place that climate change, and forget climate change if you don't believe in it. Look at the record where homes simply can't withstand the weather. And yet we're asked to pay to rebuild. HUD's asked for money, and EDA's asked for money. So this repeated disaster-prone account, whatever we want to call it, if you put it all together, the increasing costs because of people behaving in very irrational ways. Another arena deals with intelligence. We have, for many years, we had the CIA. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. It performed an important function, but now we have the DIA and we have JSOC. And if you look at some of these accounts and what's happening to them, you'll go, why do they each have duplicative systems in a given area? So my question really is, you can look across the government and look at what I call cost drivers that have a solution, but we can't seem to get clarity on how to get there. I think we could save a lot of money. And I would only encourage you to perhaps ask your examiners to pinpoint some of those accounts and to look at them very carefully.
I do think that there are a number of areas where we can think through how do we get to a better place with regard to these issues, and the examiners do watch them and bring them up as part of our review process is when you start to see them. And some of them, one specifically that actually is in the budget that this committee probably would be very interested in is it's the Civilian Real Property Committee there is property that is in excess and not used in the federal government, and as an example of what you're talking about, but one's ability to get rid of that property, because it, to be honest, is district by district, is very difficult, and so you need a process where everyone buys in and that there's an up or down vote so that it's owned by all, and people don't have to. That's something that's in the, so we look for these places and then try to move them forward. Yesterday, the GAO testified on the cuts and consolidations, the cuts report, that a duplication report. And the good news is that actually in the last few years, we found a couple areas where we actually have made progress. And so the list has gone from 200 down, and that's actually because we've gotten some of those savings. And so I think it's a matter of identifying them and then finding the way that we can work together, because almost any of the issues, and even the ones that you mentioned, I'm sure you all are very familiar with the flood bill that you recently voted, that was recently voted on. And so there are, obviously differing points of view about some of the issues you raised, but I think if we can identify them and then start to work them. But I agree with you, I think there are a number of places, and we do need to keep track. And some of the things that increase, you have to get to the bottom of why. And some of the things, in terms of why there are things in two places, ask the question. Sometimes it's a legitimate answer, and sometimes it's not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder.
Director Burwell, I actually want to dovetail a little bit off of my colleague Ms. Capter's comments, and that I think one of the challenges we face is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have the type of ability to know what real property the federal government owns, where it is, what it's costing the taxpayers in a centralized spot where a constituent could go and search areas of the country and know what the federal government owns. And I mentioned this to the GSA when they came before our committee. They're actually working on a database in response to some of our concerns, and that's just such a small sliver of our property. If we can't account for what we own, how could we ever properly manage our assets? And so I think that's an area where we're going to have to, and if you have proposals, we need to fix that problem to keep the federal government accountable to taxpayers. I want to go back to our conversation we're having about the national debt and long-term versus short-term, and we're looking out not only 5, 10 years, but 30, 40 years, because of the demographics you raised as well, challenges that our country is going to be facing. And I guess the House is going to consider budgets this week. They're going to consider the President's budget, I believe. They're going to consider the House budget. They're going to consider other options of different coalitions and caucuses. In terms of the President's budget, the House budget, I think, that's going to go forward balances within a 10-year window. When does the President's budget balance?
The President's budget balances in the out years, and as I said earlier, it's not because we, at this point in time, believe in the 10-year window. That's not the objective or goal.
I understand that, but does you say in the out years?
Yes. Yes.
Does the President's budget ever balance?
Yes, it does.
What year?
I would have to go, but as I said, it's not because we don't focus on it as a budget number. I'm happy to get the year.
We're focusing on longer term. I'm trying to get away from the short term. I think this Congress and this city spends too much time focused on 1, 2, 3, even the 10-year window. I mean, we're looking at where are we going with entitlement programs over the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next 3 decades. And so if the policies we're pursuing don't budget within 10 years, don't balance within 10 years, I'm assuming the President's budget doesn't balance within the next decade.
That's correct.
Okay. So it doesn't balance within the next decade. The House budget does. I guess we need some certainty. If we carry these policies out, does this budget ever balance? Because my fear is, since we've never run balanced budgets in this town, that culture has gotten to the point where the administration, and Republican administrations may do this as well, that we're not even submitting budgets that ever balance. And so I'd love for you to let us know when we could expect the President's proposal to balance. But there was another question I asked in our earlier dialogue regarding the Medicare warning. And my question was, regarding the federal statute that says if there is a Medicare funding warning made in a year the President shall submit to Congress within the 15-day period beginning on the date of the budget submission to Congress, under subsection A for the succeeding year, proposed legislation to respond to such warning. Has a Medicare funding warning been issued, and has the President issued proposed legislation to respond to such warning in accordance with federal statutes?
I would leave the first question in detail to my colleagues that are the Medicare trustees, Secretary Sebelius and Secretary Liu, but yes, warning. And we consider our budget our proposal for how to handle the Medicare issues. That's what we believe is our proposal in terms of responding to the second part of your question.
Do you think that meets the statutory requirement? So then,
with regard, yes, we do, and we believe we follow the Bush administration's interpretation of that statutory requirement.
which could also be incorrect. I think I think the idea is that the way the statute reads is that after a budget submission, there's a separate proposal related to the Medicare funding warning. And, you know, we can argue, I guess, if it's within the budget or not, but it gets back to my fundamental point we're having in our last dialogue. My question really was, what are the long-term entitlement solutions, Medicare, Social Security solutions? And your response was, I think one of which we hear a lot from the administration, which is we've got to, you know, find balance and we've got to figure out what the slope we're on. And I guess, you know, the House has put together a proposal called premium support. It, you know, really came out of the Clinton White House in some form or another. Alice Rivlin and others who are part of the administration you were in talked about the idea of Medicare Advantage for all. It's had bipartisan support. It may not be the answer. It's something the House is going to consider again. What is the approach that the administration, what are the specific proposals related to response to that Medicare funding warning? So if they're in the budget, what are the specific Medicare fixes that the administration has put forward in response to that statutory obligation?
So we have a number of proposals that add up to about $400 billion, and those proposals include things from making sure that we address what we believe are excessive and overpayments, that actually things that have even been written about as recently as yesterday, with regard to things that have been recommended by issues by the GAO and MedPAC as well. They address those kinds of issues. They try and put in structural reforms that create the incentives for types of delivery that will then result in further savings when people are incented to deliver impact, and so putting certain constraints on funding. So there are a number of different proposals that add up to $400 billion in our budget. And I guess I would also say I think it is about the choices that we make. With regard to the premium support issues and the proposal that is part of the Ryan budget, when one looks at that, one sees that for traditional Medicare, that you will increase premiums between $800 and $1,500. In the CBO report, it is pretty clear you're going to make a choice between increasing premiums or savings. You can't actually do both. And so I think the question then becomes, what specifics? And so if the choices are about those kinds of premium increases, and there are numbers that say you could do this possibly without increasing premiums, but when you do that, you don't get the savings. And then the question is so what actually is the plan in terms of Medicare, specific Medicare proposals that will result in those kinds of savings?
Well, I guess I would just submit that the response of the administration, albeit maybe well-intentioned, does not respond to the Medicare funding warning in a way that would actually fix the problem. And I know there's a lot of risk that goes in with the courage to address these issues, and I understand that. And you know, people in both parties get beaten up in the House and Senate for taking that sort of courageous stance. Both parties have done it, and both parties don't do it. So it's not a partisan attack other than to say, in order to solve this problem, we're going to need strong leadership from the President to be able to respond to these warnings in a way that actually fixes the problem. And I understand you're saying overpayments, and you know everyone's going to agree on that, and you know certain things. But the warnings and the statement from the trustees that say lawmakers should address the financial challenges facing Social Security and Medicare as soon as possible. Taking action sooner than later will leave more options on the table and more time available to phase in changes so the public has adequate time to prepare. I just wish the administration would be willing to do that and provide the leadership. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I think we all want to work together. Let me ask one last question. We worked together when we passed the omnibus spending bill in January, and it shows you that when we get together, we can work together. But I want to ask a question about executive authority, because it is concerning sometimes that when we do work together. And then if you hear the president say, well, if it doesn't work out exactly the way I'd like it to work out, then I can issue an executive order. And I always wonder, I mean, some people say, where does he get that authority? And you're kind of working in the White House every day. Does the OMB get involved in deciding what laws to enforce or not enforce, or like with some of the affordable health care, the decisions to delay things? Is that something OMB gets involved in?
You know, our role is in our statutory areas, and so in the space of regulation or in the spaces when IRS regulations don't come through OMB. That was something that was a decision, and a memorandum was written during the Reagan years, and so we follow what has been protocol since then.
Do you know who in the administration makes those decisions?
I
Because
think the
the reason I ask that is because that impacts spending and revenue, and I want to, sometimes when those changes get made, that whether it's an executive order, an extension, whatever you want to call it, that has to impact in some way, shape, or form the revenues and expenditures that are taking place. And so that's part of what your job is, to keep track of that. And I wonder, that's why I asked that question. Who makes that decision? I think
it varies in terms of which thing one is talking about. In terms of the issues of data collection, in terms of some of the things that were announced this week, in terms of the issue of what data a federal contractor will keep and show, data transparency. That's something that the Department of Labor will implement, because if anything's going to relate to federal contractors, because contracting is a part of what OMB does, those things do come through. So it depends on which area or
But
thing.
when it does impact either the revenue or spending side, is that something somebody tries? I guess, like some of the healthcare, when you change some of the mandates that are going to impact somehow overall spending, somebody keeps track of that, because that would be, I mean, as we try to.
And in those spaces, we are consulted. OMB is consulted, and our health team is consulted in spaces that impact in that space. I thought, sort of the executive orders or those sorts of things. And that's why I think it depends on an issue-by-issue basis where it will come in and have contact with OMB. When the Department of Labor is asked to do a rulemaking, that'll come in through OIRA. With regard to some of the kinds of changes you're talking about, that's sometimes done in consultation with the health team, depending on what it is and where it's coming from.
I got
the
you.
IRS makes its decisions on the own, in terms of
sure somebody's keeping track of the
puts and takes with regard to the dollars, yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Mr. Rano.
Thank you. I just have one last question that came to mind. The more I hear about, what problems we face in the future, the more I am convinced that we have to do something about immigration reform and put everybody out of the shadows and paying taxes and so on. And we talk about what's going to happen in the next decades. Well, we would know under immigration reform that at least 11 million people, not to mention their children, would be forced to do the right thing, which now they may not be doing, not only because some of them want to get away with something, but because they can't openly or publicly say I'm here and I'm working and I'm paying taxes or whatever. So my question to you is, how far off do you think all the estimates, everybody has an estimate on how much it would bring into the economy if we did immigration reform, and I've even seen, $160 billion over a couple of years and so on. Does OMB get into that, into trying to find out what the real numbers could be if we were able to do immigration reform?
As part of our budget, we've used CBO's estimates. So we have used the CBO estimates that exist, and that's where we are based our numbers on CBO's.
And CBO believes that it's huge numbers, right?
Yes, and CBO analyzed the particular title, and I think this is what you're referring to, is when you have that increase in the labor force.
Right.
That is something that positively impacts our GDP and a number of things in our nation. And so that is a specific title in the bill. And so that when CBO scored it, that's what it was. And so we use that as the basis for what's in our budget.
There are, and this is just sort of an aside immigration comment, I have found out that there are members of Congress, in some cases on both sides of the aisle, who have two concerns with what some of us propose. One is, you broke the law coming into the country, we shouldn't reward you for that. And then there is the unfortunate political issue of, well, in the case of Latinos, for instance, they'll all be Democrats. This will probably cost me a lot of trouble, but once you get immigration off the table, you'd be surprised how some people are more conservative than you think they are. But as long as immigration is on the table, they will lean one way only because they see one group supporting them on immigration. But I can't predict what Latinos will be like as voters once this issue is off the table. I suspect they'll be like all other Americans. It'll break down. I mean, didn't Hawaii and Alaska come in at the same time because we were certain Hawaii was going to be Republican and Alaska Democrat? Tell that to Don Young, right? I mean, it didn't work that way. But anyway, thank you for your service, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time allotted, the extra time.
Thank you. Mr. Ray, you have any further questions?
We'll stay at rest here. Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Chairman.
And Ms. Capter? Great. Well, once again, thank you so much for being here today. I know you've got a big job and a tough job, and we want to work together with you any way we can to help keep things on the right track.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.